Chapter 6, Part 1 of Queen Victoria. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Queen Victoria by Giles Lytton Strachey. Chapter 6, Part 1. Chapter 6. Last Years of Prince Consort. 1. The weak-willed youth who took no interest in politics and never read a newspaper had grown into a man of unbending determination whose tireless energies were incessantly concentrated upon the laborious business of government and the highest questions of state. He was busy now from morning till night. In the winter, before the dawn, he was to be seen seated at his writing table, working by the light of the green reading lamp which he had brought over with him from Germany, and the construction of which he had much improved by an ingenious device. Victoria was early too, but she was not so early as Albert, and when in the chill darkness she took her seat at her own writing table, placed side by side with his, she invariably found upon it a neat pile of papers arranged for her inspection and her signature. The day thus begun continued in unremitting industry. At breakfast the newspapers, the once hated newspapers, made their appearance, and the Prince, absorbed in their perusal, would answer no questions, or, if an article struck him, he would read it aloud. After that there were ministers and secretaries to interview. There was a vast correspondence to be carried on. There were numerous memoranda to be made. Victoria, treasuring every word, preserving every letter, was all breathless attention and eager obedience. Sometimes Albert would actually ask her advice. He consulted her about his English. "Lese recht aufmerksam und sage, wenn irgendein Fehler ist," he would say. Note: read this carefully and tell me if there are any mistakes in it. End of note. Or, as he handed her a draft for her signature, he would observe, "Ich hab dir hier ein Draft gemacht, lese es mal. Ich dachte, es war recht so." Note: here is a draft I have made for you. Read it. I should think this would do. End of note. Thus the diligent, scrupulous, absorbing hours passed by. Fewer and fewer grew the moments of recreation and of exercise. The demands of society were narrowed down to the smallest limits, and even then but grudgingly attended to. It was no longer a mere pleasure; it was a positive necessity to go to bed as early as possible, in order to be up and at work on the morrow betimes. The important and exacting business of government, which became at last the dominating preoccupation in Albert's mind, still left unimpaired his old tastes and interests. He remained devoted to art, to science, to philosophy, and a multitude of subsidiary activities showed how his energies increased as the demands upon them grew. For whenever duty called, the Prince was all alertness. With indefatigable perseverance he opened museums, laid the foundation stones of hospitals, made speeches to the Royal Agricultural Society, and attended meetings of the British Association. The National Gallery particularly interested him. He drew up careful regulations for the arrangement of the pictures according to schools, and he attempted, though in vain, to have the whole collection transported to South Kensington. Feodora, now the Princess Hohenlohe, after a visit to England, expressed in a letter to Victoria her admiration of Albert, both as a private and a public character. Nor did she rely only on her own opinion. "I must just copy out," she said, "what Mr. Klumpp wrote to me some little time ago, and which is quite true. Prince Albert is one of the few royal personages who can sacrifice to any principle, as soon as it has become evident to them to be good and noble, all those notions or sentiments to which others, owing to their narrow-mindedness or to the prejudices of their rank, are so thoroughly inclined strongly to cling. There's something so truly religious in this," the Princess added, "as well as humane and just, most soothing to my feelings, which are so often hurt and disturbed by what I hear and see." Victoria, from the depth of her heart, subscribed to all the eulogies of Feodora and Mr. Klumpp. She only found that they were insufficient. As she watched her beloved Albert, after toiling with state documents and public functions, devoting every spare moment of his time to domestic duties, to artistic appreciation, and to intellectual improvements; as she listened to him cracking his jokes at the luncheon table, or playing Mendelssohn on the organ, or pointing out the merits of Sir Edwin Landseer's pictures; as she followed him round while he gave instructions about the breeding of cattle, or decided that the Gainsboroughs must be hung higher up so that the Winterhalters might be properly seen, she felt perfectly certain that no other wife had ever had such a husband. His mind was apparently capable of everything, and she was hardly surprised to learn that he had made an important discovery for the conversion of sewage into agricultural manure. Filtration from below upwards, he explained, through some appropriate medium which retained the solids and set free the fluid sewage for irrigation, was the principle of the scheme. "All previous plans," he said, "would have cost millions; mine costs next to nothing." Unfortunately, owing to a slight miscalculation, the invention proved to be impracticable; but Albert's intelligence was unrebuffed, and he passed on, to plunge with all his accustomed ardour into a prolonged study of the rudiments of lithography. But naturally it was upon his children that his private interests and those of Victoria were concentrated most vigorously. The royal nurseries showed no sign of emptying. The birth of the Prince Arthur in 1850 was followed 3 years later by that of the Prince Leopold, and in 1857 the Princess Beatrice was born. A family of 9 must be, in any circumstances, a grave responsibility, and the Prince realised to the full how much the high destinies of his offspring intensified the need of parental care. It was inevitable that he should believe profoundly in the importance of education. He himself had been the product of education. Stockmar had made him what he was; it was for him, in his turn, to be a Stockmar, to be even more than a Stockmar to the young creatures he had brought into the world. Victoria would assist him. A Stockmar, no doubt, she could hardly be, but she could be perpetually vigilant; she could mingle strictness with her affection; she could always set a good example. These considerations, of course, applied pre eminently to the education of the Prince of Wales. How tremendous was the significance of every particle of influence which went to the making of the future King of England! Albert set to work with a will; but, watching with Victoria the minutest details of the physical, intellectual, and moral training of his children, he soon perceived, to his distress, that there was something unsatisfactory in the development of his eldest son. The Princess Royal was an extremely intelligent child, but Bertie, though he was good humoured and gentle, seemed to display a deep-seated repugnance to every form of mental exertion. This was most regrettable, but the remedy was obvious. The parental efforts must be redoubled; instruction must be multiplied; not for a single instant must the educational pressure be allowed to relax. Accordingly, more tutors were selected, the curriculum was revised, the timetable of studies was rearranged, elaborate memoranda dealing with every possible contingency were drawn up. It was above all essential that there should be no slackness. "Work," said the Prince, "must be work." And work indeed it was. The boy grew up amid a ceaseless round of paradigms, syntactical exercises, dates, genealogical tables, and lists of capes. Constant notes flew backwards and forwards between the Prince, the Queen, and the tutors, with inquiries, with reports of progress, with detailed recommendations; and these notes were all carefully preserved for future reference. It was, besides, vital that the heir to the throne should be protected from the slightest possibility of contamination from the outside world. The Prince of Wales was not as other boys. He might occasionally be allowed to invite some sons of the nobility, boys of good character, to play with him in the garden of Buckingham Palace; but his father presided, with alarming precision, over their sports. In short, every possible precaution was taken, every conceivable